So as evidence in favor of Friedman's statement here, here's a nice example. We have Peru between 1980 and 1995. And the red line is the money supply and the blue line is the price level. And you look, they are very close to each other. They diverge later on, but they are, in effect, directly tracking each other. On the other hand, here on the right, you have the growth rate, not the actual amount. And what you see is a similar tracking. In other words, that it looks pretty clear that the main cause here for a change in the price level is a change in the money supply. Again, here's the claim that inflation is always and everywhere the monetary phenomenon. We have the money growth rate on the horizontal. We have the inflation rate on the vertical. Boy, these are pretty close to the line. There's a little bit of deviation, but as regression lines go, I can tell you that this is a pretty close fit. Now, of course, as I mentioned, this isn't always the case. So let's take a situation where velocity and the money supply are constant, but there's economic growth. In other words, y is greater than 0. If m and v are constant, what would happen? In other words, how could we keep the price level constant with increasing output? So the first question would be, what would happen? And the answer is the price level would have to go down because the left-hand side is 0, and the percent change in output is greater than 0. And so the price level would decrease at a percentage, would contract at a percentage that is the inverse of the growth rate in the economy. So the standard argument, again, if we think about prices, we shouldn't forget what we covered in the run-up to this. Basically, that prices are signals and prices convey a lot of information. So if we start messing with the signals, we're almost certainly going to get some distortions in the economy. And so here what we could see is maybe a legitimate goal would be to keep constant prices. And so what would need to happen now, nobody has control over velocity and nobody has control over the price level. And so our control valve or our pressure valve here, if we want to keep the price level constant, we would need to keep the growth rate in the price level at 0. And that would mean that we would need to grow the money supply at the rate of growth in the economy. So this is the actual economic argument for the Federal Reserve growing the money supply at the growth rate of the economy. It is not to stimulate the economy. It is not because it causes more economic growth. It is instead, we have to keep the money supply growing at the rate of growth in the economy in order to avoid deflation. So that's one of these answers. How could we keep the price level constant with constant output but a decrease in velocity? In many ways, that's what we've seen recently. Velocity has dramatically decreased. People are shoving dollar bills under their bed as a result of the crisis rather than sending it across the bridge. Financial organizations are not lending very much, which means basically velocity has shrunk significantly. So let's say the output rate is constant, right? So we're keeping the growth rate in the economy at 0. It's neither expanding nor contracting. Now we could expand this to include more pieces than that. But basically, percent change in y is 0. Velocity has plummeted. In order to keep the price level constant, what would we need to do? Well, we would need to grow the money supply directly the opposite. So if the velocity contracted by 10%, we would need to increase the money supply by 10%. Again, that isn't going to stimulate economic growth. That's not the argument here. That's a separate argument which we're going to come to later. Right now, there's no stimulation effect. This is simply to keep our signal and communication system that is contained in prices intact, to keep from basically devaluing or messing with our communication system. So hopefully this gives you some sense. You can look through a number of different alternatives. You could say, what happens if the economy grows at, let's add this to the homework. The economy grows at 3%. Velocity grows at 1%. What do we need to do to the price level? What do we need to do to the money supply to keep the price level constant? And what would happen to the price level if we did nothing to the money supply? Again, you can rewind and listen to that again. Add that to your homework for next class. Double check and see if you understand what's going on. Okay, so here would be the claim. The claim that Friedman made is that in the long run, money is neutral. In other words, in the long run, changing the money supply is not going to have real impacts. Now, this was my claim, which was that basically there's not a stimulation effect. People are going to figure this out. Similar to if every year the value of a pound got cut in half, in other words, it now takes 2 pounds to make up what last year there was a pound, is that going to have any real impact? Well, not really. I think most of us are going to figure out that next year, what was a pound now takes 2 pounds, and we're going to adjust. But of course, maybe it is possible. Now, we know here that output is determined by the factors of production. So changing M can only affect Y if it increases the factors of production or increases the rate at which those factors of production are used. This is possible in the short run, but it is not, in my view, at all plausible in the long run. Basically, it would involve tricking people over and over again, which would involve people being morons, which any model of the world that is based on people being morons, in my view, is not a very good model. So let's talk about the cost of inflation. Now, it is possible in the short run to stimulate the economy, but it is much the same way as stimulating the economy like stimulating me with a cattle prod. It will cause me to jump. It will stimulate my muscles, but not in a way that most of us would enjoy. Or for those of you who grew up out in more rural areas, it will stimulate the economy the way that grabbing onto an electric fence stimulated us as kids. We used to grab on and see who could hold on the longest. Of course, as people dropped out, the shock got stronger. It's a whole nother story. So it turns out that inflation causes distortions and misallocation of resources, causes price confusion and money illusion, and it causes a redistribution of wealth, and it can break down financial intermediation. So now we're getting into, again, the why we care about this. It's not just purely an academic question. We have a pretty good answer. Hyperinflation, by the way, is going to be a monetary phenomenon, right? Because the economy is not going to be contracting by 7,000% or 700%. It can't. It can't, because if it contracted, the most an economy can contract by is going to be what? 100%, right? Our new minus our old, right? Say it was 0 before, so 0 minus 100 divided by 100, that's going to be -1 times 100 is going to be -100. So in other words, at that point, there would be no economy and everybody would starve to death. So there's no way that you could actually have changes in the economy yielding hyperinflation. Okay. It also turns out that inflation interacts with taxes, and it is painful to stop. So here's the cost of inflation. So let's think about the redistribution. Basically, oftentimes we'll talk about it being from citizens to government, but the truth is that the government is comprised of citizens. So it's more accurate to think about redistribution from some citizens to other citizens, whether those citizens be bureaucrats or the beneficiaries of government programs. Turns out inflation is always a tax, and it's a tax on people who hold money and cash, which means that it's actually a fairly regressive tax because the poor tend to have less access to financial intermediation. They tend to hold more money in cash. There's also redistribution between lenders and borrowers. But before we get there, let's just think about that general level of redistribution. And I'll put this up here. We can come back to this in a moment. But basically, let's think about what happens with the redistribution generally. So basically, let's envision, so when I was in Iraq, there were people who were guarding my neighborhood. They were the Peshmerga, literally the men who faced death. They used to be, rebel fighters in the mountains, and now they have been incorporated into the public security apparatus. So let's take a look at some bureaucrat who decides, hey, you know what? Let's pay the Peshmerga more. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to run off a whole bunch of money from our printing presses. We're just going to print a bunch of money and we're going to hand it out to the Peshmerga. What, of course, do the Peshmerga conclude about that? If we go back, nope, maybe we go back further. There we go. So, what do those Peshmerga think? They are going to mistake money, an increase in their money incomes, for an increase in their actual incomes, their real incomes. And what are they going to do? Like with most things, when income goes up, people typically go out and buy more goods and services. And that's going to be an increase in demand. Then that's going to cause an increase in the price level. And because what are shopkeepers going to do? They're going to say, oh, there's been this increase in demand, and they're going to mistake an increase in the price level for an increase in demand. They're going to work longer hours. They're going to spend more time away from their friends and family. They're going to make more falafel sandwiches for these Peshmerga, and then then the tailors in town are also going to make more outfits for these Peshmerga wives. Then, of course, after they've done this, the falafel vendor is going to go over to the jilly curdy maker, that's what you called outfits, and they're going to say, okay, I want to buy an outfit for my wife. And what are they going to discover? They're going to discover that the price has gone up. Simultaneously, the tailor is going to go get some more lunch, and they're going to discover that, hey, the prices at the falafel vendor have gone up. They will discover that they have mistaken an increase in prices for an increase in demand. Of course, what happens next? Well, the next time the Peshmerga show up, the merchants are going to be somewhat savvy to this. They're going to say, you know what? I bet these Peshmerga are bringing me money that is going to be worth less in the period of time. Now, these people don't have to have any understanding whatsoever of the quantity theory of money, but I think they're going to draw some conclusions here. And as soon as the Peshmerga show up, they're going to just increase their prices. And so what the Peshmerga are going to discover eventually is that they saw an increase in their money income, but that was not an increase in their real income. They got paid more, but their extra pay bought them no additional goods and services. And so what this means is that in the short run, we can stimulate the economy, but we really stimulate the economy by tricking people. Remember that falafel maker and the jilly curdy maker spent extra time and energy away from their friends and loved ones. They spent more time at the office for no additional pay. That redistributed time, energy, and resources from the merchants to the Peshmerga. Now, eventually, the Peshmerga are going to probably work more once they get that extra pay. They're gonna do more favors for the politicians, etc. They're going to spend more time guarding stuff and taking risks. And then they're going to subsequently discover that they have done so with no increase in their real income, that they mistook an increase in money for an increase in income. And eventually, the next time the bureaucrat comes to them and says, hey, here's a bunch of extra money, they are simply going to update their expectations and say, I bet all of the prices are going to go up.